Ma'am, I don't care if you have a boarding pass. There's no room for people like you on this flight. Those 12 words hung in the air like poison spreading through the crowded gate area until every nearby passenger fell silent. 12 words that would echo through boardrooms and courtrooms and break rooms for years to come. 12 words that the woman who spoke them, a gate agent named Linda Marsh, would come to regret more than anything she had ever said in her entire life. But in that moment, standing behind her counter at Gate 47 of Newark Liberty International Airport, Linda felt nothing but satisfaction. She had put another difficult passenger in her place. She had maintained order. She had done her job. If you have ever been made to feel like you don't belong somewhere, you have every right to be. If you have ever been judged not by your character, but by the color of your skin, if you have ever stood in a line watching others breeze through while you were stopped and questioned and made to prove your worth, then stay until the end of this story. Because sometimes the person they dismiss is the person who owns the building they are standing in. And sometimes justice arrives, not with a shout, but with a whisper that changes everything. Newark Liberty International Airport on New Year's Eve was the kind of chaos that made even seasoned travelers question their life choices. Terminal C buzzed with the desperate energy of thousands of people, all trying to get somewhere else before midnight, all convinced that their journey was the most important one happening that night. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made healthy people look sick and tired people look half dead. The air was thick with competing smells. Burnt coffee from the Starbucks that had closed an hour ago. Greasy pizza from the Sparrow that was somehow still serving customers. The sharp chemical tang of industrial cleaning solution. And underneath it all, the faint petroleum whisper of jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac through doors that never quite sealed properly. The departure boards flickered with a mixture of green for on time, amber for delayed, and the occasional devastating red for canceled. Every few minutes, the overhead speakers crackled to life with announcements that nobody could quite understand, garbled syllables bouncing off hard surfaces until they became meaningless noise. Somewhere near Gate 52, a baby was screaming with the particular fury of an infant who had been in an airport for far too long. Somewhere near the food court, a man was arguing loudly into his phone about a connecting flight in Charlotte that he was definitely going to miss. Near the security checkpoint, a woman was crying softly while a TSA agent explained that her snow globe souvenir was considered a liquid and would have to be confiscated. It was December 31st. The clock on the wall read 11:43 p.m. In 17 minutes, it would be a new year, and most of the people in this terminal would still be exactly where they were now, trapped in the purgatory between where they had been and where they wanted to be. Naomi Carter stood in line at Gate 47, her carry-on bag slung over one shoulder and her leather laptop case over the other. She had been standing in this line for 23 minutes, which was 23 minutes longer than she had expected when she arrived at the gate to find boarding already in progress. The line was moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, shuffling forward a few inches at a time, like a glacier making its way toward an inevitable destination. She looked nothing like the woman whose photograph hung in the executive boardroom 14 floors above this terminal. In that photograph, taken 3 years ago for an industry magazine profile, Naomi wore a tailored charcoal Armani suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo that had required 2 hours in a salon chair. Her expression projected the quiet confidence of a woman who had built an empire from nothing and knew exactly what she was worth. Diamond studs glinted in her ears. A Cartier watch circled her wrist. Everything about that photograph said power, success, authority. Tonight she wore a gray cashmere sweater that she had owned for 8 years, soft and comfortable, and starting to pill slightly at the elbows. Her jeans were dark and well-fitted, but unremarkable, the kind you could buy at any department store. Her sneakers were white leather, chosen for comfort rather than style, with a small scuff on the left toe from where she had kicked a door frame the week before. Her hair was pulled back in a simple twist, held in place by a plain black elastic band. No diamond studs tonight, no Cartier watch, just a thin gold chain around her neck that had belonged to her grandmother, the only piece of jewelry she never took off regardless of what else she was wearing. She carried no designer handbag, no obviously expensive accessories, nothing that would mark her as a woman of significant means. She looked like exactly what she wanted to look like tonight. A tired traveler trying to get home to her family for New Year's Eve. An ordinary passenger on an ordinary flight. Just another face in the crowd. What nobody in that line knew, what nobody in this entire terminal suspected, was that Naomi Carter was the CEO and majority shareholder of Carter Aviation Holdings. The company that owned Terminal C and held majority operating contracts with every airline that flew out of this building. The company that employed every single person working behind every counter, at every gate, in every restaurant and shop and kiosk in this terminal. She had built this empire over 23 years, starting with a single regional airport in Montgomery, Alabama, that every industry analyst had said would fail within 18 months. They had been wrong. She had been right. And now she owned 8 airports across the northeastern United States, employed over 42,000 people, and had fundamentally transformed the regional aviation industry. But tonight, she was traveling incognito. Not as a test or a game or some kind of undercover boss reality show stunt. She was doing this because she genuinely wanted to understand what her customers experienced when they walked through her terminals. For the past 6 months, she had been receiving a steady stream of complaints about Terminal C specifically. Passengers being treated rudely by staff. Unexplained delays and cancellations that seemed to affect some flights more than others. A general culture of indifference that had drifted far from the customer-first philosophy she had built her company on. She had tried to address these complaints through normal channels. She had sent memos. She had held meetings. She had implemented new training programs and accountability measures. Nothing seemed to work. The complaints kept coming, so she had decided to see for herself. Book a regular flight under her own name, Naomi J. Carter, without any corporate flags or VIP notifications. Travel like any other passenger. Observe without being observed. Experience what her customers experienced. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her jeans. She pulled it out and saw a text message from her mother. The words appearing on the screen in the large font size her mother insisted on using because her eyes weren't what they used to be. "Baby, are you on the plane yet? Can't wait to see you. Made your favorite sweet potato pie." Naomi smiled despite her exhaustion. Her mother, Dorothy Carter, was 78 years old and had been battling congestive heart failure for the past 14 months. Every visit felt precious now, in a way that visits hadn't felt when Naomi was younger. When she was too busy building her career to make time for Sunday dinners. When she always had a meeting or a crisis or a flight to catch. She had missed too many holidays, too many birthdays, too many ordinary Tuesday evenings when nothing special was happening, but her mother was alive and well and would have loved to see her. She wasn't going to miss this one. She had promised. She typed back quickly, her thumbs moving across the screen with the practiced speed of someone who had sent 10,000 text messages in her life. Almost boarding Mama. Save me a big slice. Love you more than anything. She added a heart emoji and a pie emoji and a fireworks emoji because her mother loved emojis and had only recently discovered that they existed. Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket and shuffled forward another few inches with the rest of the line. She was close enough now to see the gate agent clearly. A blonde woman, probably mid-30s, with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that looked almost painfully severe. Her airline uniform was crisp and properly fitted, her makeup carefully applied, her posture rigidly professional. Her name tag, which Naomi could just barely read from this distance, said Linda Marsh. Something about her expression, about the way she was interacting with the passengers at the front of the line, made Naomi pay closer attention. There was an impatience there, a barely concealed irritation, as if every passenger who approached was a personal inconvenience rather than a paying customer. Naomi watched as Linda processed a white man in an expensive business suit. The interaction was smooth, professional, almost warm. Linda smiled. She made eye contact. She said something that made the man chuckle as he gathered his boarding pass and headed down the jetway. Next came a young white couple, college-aged, dressed in the casual dishevelment of people who had been traveling all day. Another smooth interaction. Linda smiled. The young woman complimented Linda's nail polish. Linda thanked her and wished them a happy new year. Then came an elderly black woman, probably in her 70s, neatly dressed in a floral print blouse and comfortable slacks. She handed over her boarding pass and ID with a smile. And something shifted. Naomi couldn't hear the exact words from where she was standing, but she could see the change in Linda's body language, the smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the slightly longer scrutiny of the documents, the way Linda leaned back almost imperceptibly as if creating distance. The elderly woman's smile faltered. She said something, probably answering a question. Linda responded. The elderly woman's shoulders drooped slightly, a subtle deflation that spoke of familiar disappointment. Then she gathered her things and walked toward the jetway, moving a little slower than she had before. Naomi felt something cold begin to form in her chest. She had seen this before. Too many times to count over her 52 years of being a black woman in America. The subtle shift in treatment that happened so quickly, so quietly, that you could almost convince yourself you had imagined it. The way certain people were welcomed and certain other people were merely tolerated. The 1,000 tiny cuts that accumulated over a lifetime until you had so much scar tissue you almost didn't feel them anymore. Almost. The line continued to move glacially slow. Naomi checked her watch. 11:51 p.m. 9 minutes until midnight. She should have been in the air by now, should have been watching the lights of New York City fade beneath the clouds, while flight attendants served champagne to celebrate the new year. Instead, she was standing in line waiting, watching, growing increasingly convinced that something was very wrong with the way this gate was being run. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only another 5 minutes, she reached the front of the line. She stepped forward to the counter and handed over her boarding pass and driver's license, the same documents she had handed over at countless airline counters in countless airports over countless years of business travel. Linda Marsh took the documents without looking up immediately. She was typing something into her computer, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. Then she glanced at the boarding pass. Then at the driver's license. Then, for the first time, at Naomi. The look lasted only a second or two, but Naomi had spent 23 years reading people across negotiating tables and in boardrooms, and in moments where millions of dollars hung on correctly interpreting a subtle shift in expression. She knew what she was seeing. Linda's eyes traveled from Naomi's face down to her worn sweater, her unremarkable jeans, her scuffed white sneakers, then back up to her face. Something shifted in Linda's expression. A slight narrowing of the eyes, an almost imperceptible tightening of the lips, a micro-expression of judgment rendered and verdict delivered. "This is a first-class ticket," Linda said. Her tone was professional on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Skepticism, perhaps, or suspicion. "Yes," Naomi replied, keeping her voice calm and pleasant. "Yes, it is." Linda held the boarding pass up, examining it at an angle, as if checking for counterfeit markings on a $100 bill. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Naomi's driver's license, studying the photograph, comparing it to the woman standing in front of her. Then she looked at the boarding pass again. "Where did you purchase this ticket?" "Through the airline website," Naomi said. Her voice remained even, but she could feel the cold thing in her chest growing heavier. "Same place most people purchase airline tickets." Linda's lips pressed together in a thin line. She didn't scan the boarding pass. She didn't hand back the documents. Instead, she held up one finger in a gesture that said, "Wait," and turned to look for someone. Her eyes found what they were looking for: a security guard standing near the back wall, a heavy-set white man in his 40s with a buzz cut and an expression of terminal boredom. "Brad," Linda called out, her voice carrying across the gate area. "Can you come here, please? We have a situation." Several passengers in the immediate vicinity turned to look, some with curiosity. Others with the mild discomfort of people who sensed something unpleasant was about to happen and didn't want to be associated with it. Naomi felt the weight of their attention settling on her like a physical thing. The security guard Brad ambled over with the unhurried swagger of a man who enjoyed the small powers his position afforded him. His name tag identified him as Bradley Cooper, which under different circumstances might have made Naomi smile at the coincidence. His uniform was slightly too tight across the belly, his belt buckle straining against the excess weight it was being asked to contain. He positioned himself behind Naomi and slightly to the left, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the excessive application of drugstore aftershave on his skin. "What seems to be the problem?" Brad asked the question while looking at Naomi, not at Linda. His gaze was assessing suspicious, already convinced of something he had no evidence for. "I need to verify this passenger's credentials," Linda said smoothly. Something about her tone had changed now that she had backup. She sounded more confident, more authoritative. Something doesn't add up. Naomi felt her heart rate increase slightly, the physiological response to perceived threat that no amount of success or power could fully override. But she kept her expression neutral, her voice calm. What specifically doesn't add up? My boarding pass is valid. My ID matches my boarding pass. I'm in the same line as everyone else who's boarding this flight. Brad leaned closer, invading her personal space in a way that felt deliberate and intimidating. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see another form of ID. I've already shown my driver's license, Naomi said. That's all that's legally required for domestic air travel. Brad and Linda exchanged a look. It was a brief look loaded with unspoken communication, the kind of look shared between people who have developed a silent shorthand for situations like this. We have the right to request additional verification, Brad said. His voice had taken on a harder edge. It's for everyone's safety. You understand? Naomi looked around the gate area. The passengers who had been in line behind her were now being processed by a second gate agent, who had appeared from somewhere, a young Asian woman who was working quickly and efficiently to clear the backlog. None of these other passengers were being asked for additional identification. A white man in wrinkled khakis and a golf shirt walked past, boarding pass in hand, and Linda waved him through with a smile that actually reached her eyes. Have a great flight, sir. Happy New Year. I'd like to understand, Naomi said, her voice still carefully controlled, why I'm being treated differently than other passengers. Brad's expression hardened. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice. My voice is at a normal conversational volume, Naomi replied. She was aware that several more passengers were now watching, that phones were being subtly angled in her direction, that this moment was being documented whether she wanted it to be or not. I haven't raised it once. I've simply asked a question that I believe I have a right to have answered. Linda let out an exaggerated sigh, the kind designed to communicate to everyone watching that she was dealing with a difficult and unreasonable person. Look, she said, her voice louder now, carrying clearly across the gate area. First-class tickets are expensive, very expensive. We're required to verify that everything is legitimate. We get all kinds of people trying to scam their way into premium cabins. I'm sure you understand. There it was. We get all kinds of people, the emphasis on people, the implication crystal clear to anyone paying attention. Naomi understood. She had understood from the moment Linda's eyes had traveled down her body and found her wanting. This wasn't about ticket verification or security protocols or anything that could be found in any employee handbook. This was about a woman in a cashmere sweater who didn't look like she belonged in first class. This was about skin color and assumptions, and the kind of casual cruelty that people like Linda had probably been practicing for so long they didn't even recognize it as cruelty anymore. I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago, Naomi said. She was speaking to Linda, but also to everyone watching. Everyone recording everyone who would later claim they had no idea this kind of thing still happened. I paid with my own credit card. The confirmation email is in my phone. The receipt is in my email. My name is on the ticket, and my name is on my ID. What additional verification could you possibly need? Brad's hand moved to his belt, resting near his radio in a gesture that was clearly intended to be threatening. Ma'am, you're causing a disturbance. If you don't cooperate, we're going to have a real problem here. Causing a disturbance? Naomi repeated. By asking why I'm being singled out. By requesting the same treatment as every other passenger on this flight. That's causing a disturbance. A voice came from behind her. A woman's voice, older and sharp with indignation. Oh, for heaven's sake, let the woman board. She has a ticket just like everyone else. This is ridiculous. Naomi turned slightly and saw a white woman in her 60s, silver-haired and well-dressed, her expression radiating disapproval. Not at Naomi, at Linda and Brad, and the entire situation unfolding before her. The woman met Naomi's eyes and gave a small nod of solidarity, a gesture that said, "I see what's happening, and it's wrong." But another voice chimed in almost immediately, a man's voice, impatient and annoyed. "Can we move this along? Some of us have places to be. Just let them do their job, lady." The division in the watching crowd was becoming apparent. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight, avoiding eye contact, clearly wishing this would all just go away so they could board their flight in peace. Others looked genuinely concerned. Their phones raised, their expressions ranging from sympathy to outrage. A few looked openly hostile, their allegiance clearly with Linda and Brad, their assumptions about the situation evident in their body language. Linda seemed emboldened by the divided response. She straightened her spine and adopted an expression of official authority. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice carried the rehearsed quality of someone reciting from a script they had memorized long ago. "We have the right to deny boarding to any passenger who fails to comply with security procedures. If you continue to be uncooperative, you will not be flying tonight. Do you understand?" Naomi looked at her for a long moment. She looked at Brad, still standing too close, still resting his hand near his radio like a warning. She looked at the clock on the wall. 11:57 p.m. 3 minutes until midnight. Her mother was probably sitting in her living room right now, the TV tuned to the New Year's countdown, a slice of sweet potato pie waiting on the kitchen counter, her old heart beating with anticipation of seeing her only daughter walk through the door. "What specific additional documentation do you need?" Naomi asked quietly. "Tell me exactly what you want to see, and I will provide it." Linda smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We need proof of purchase, the original credit card used to buy the ticket, and we need you to step aside while we investigate further." "I don't carry physical credit cards," Naomi said. "I can show you the digital card in my phone's wallet, and I can show you the email confirmation." "That's not sufficient," Linda said. She wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction now. "I'm afraid we're going to need the physical card. No exceptions." Naomi stared at her. She understood now that this had never been about verification or security or any legitimate concern. This was about power. About the small, petty power that people like Linda and Brad could exercise over people they had decided didn't deserve respect. It didn't matter what documentation Naomi provided. There would always be another hoop to jump through, another requirement to fail, another reason why she didn't belong. Behind her, the final passengers were boarding. The gate was nearly empty now, except for the small crowd of spectators who had gathered to watch the confrontation. The clock ticked over to 11:58 p.m. A new voice entered the conversation. Kevin Marshall, Operations Supervisor, according to the name tag on his slightly rumpled Airline blazer. He was a white man in his 40s, with thinning hair and the harried expression of someone who had been dealing with problems all night and had hoped to coast through the final few minutes of his shift without another one. "What's going on here?" Kevin asked, looking at Linda and Brad rather than at Naomi. "We have a passenger who's refusing to comply with verification procedures," Linda said smoothly. "She's been causing a disturbance and making demands." "I haven't refused anything," Naomi interjected. I've provided my boarding pass and ID. I've offered to show digital payment verification. I've asked repeatedly what specific additional documentation is required. No one has given me a clear answer. Kevin finally looked at her. His eyes did the same quick scan that Linda's had done the same assessment based on appearance rather than evidence. He let out a long breath through his nose. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried the weary condescension of someone who had dealt with difficult customers too many times to count. "Our staff has the authority to request additional verification when they determine it's warranted. I'm sure you can appreciate that we have security concerns." "What warranted it in my case?" Naomi asked. "Specifically, what about me prompted this level of scrutiny that wasn't applied to any other passenger?" "I watched board this flight." Kevin's expression flickered with something. Annoyance, maybe, or the slight discomfort of a man who knew he was on shaky ground, but was committed to the position anyway. "We don't have to explain our security protocols to passengers. If you have a complaint, you can file it through the proper channels." "The proper channels," Naomi repeated. "You mean the channels that have received dozens of complaints about this specific gate agent in the past 6 months? Those proper channels." The words landed like a slap. Linda's face went pale. Brad shifted uncomfortably. Kevin's eyes widened slightly before he managed to compose his features back into professional neutrality. "I'm not sure where you're getting your information," Kevin said carefully, "but employee records are confidential." Naomi smiled, but there was no humor in it. "A lot of things are confidential until they end up in a lawsuit, or on the evening news, or in front of a congressional committee investigating discriminatory practices in the airline industry." The silence that followed was heavy-charged with the electricity of a situation that had suddenly shifted in ways that no one quite understood. Kevin studied Naomi more closely now, trying to reconcile her worn sweater and casual jeans with the confident authority in her voice. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "who exactly are you?" "I'm a passenger," Naomi replied, "with a valid ticket, trying to board a flight, the same as everyone else who's walked through this gate tonight. The only difference is that I'm being treated like a criminal instead of a customer, and I'd like to understand why." Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the gate phone rang. Linda picked it up, listened for a moment, then put her hand over the receiver and looked at Kevin with something approaching panic in her eyes. "They're closing the aircraft door," she said. "We need to make a decision." Kevin rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at Naomi, then at the small crowd of passengers still watching, several of whom had their phones raised and recording. He looked at Brad, who shrugged in a way that communicated nothing helpful. "Ma'am," Kevin said finally, "I apologize for any confusion. Please go ahead and board. It should have felt like a victory." But as Naomi took a step toward the jetway, Linda made one final move. She blocked the path with her body, not aggressively, but firmly, her expression fixed in a smile that was more like a baring of teeth. "Actually," Linda said, "we've already closed the boarding door. I'm afraid you've missed the flight." Naomi looked at her. She looked at the jetway door, still visibly open. She looked at the aircraft visible through the window, its lights blinking, its engines still quiet, clearly not yet prepared for departure. "The door is still open," she observed. "It's closed in the system," Linda replied. Her smile widened. "There's nothing I can do. You'll have to be rebooked on tomorrow's flight." Behind her, several passengers gasped. The silver-haired woman who had spoken up earlier stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous," she said. "I watched you close that door, just now, on purpose, to prevent this woman from boarding." "Ma'am, please step back," Brad said, positioning himself between the woman and Linda. "This doesn't concern you. It concerns everyone," the woman shot back. "What I just witnessed was deliberate discrimination. I'm a retired attorney and I know exactly what I saw." Kevin raised his hands in a gesture of placation. "Everyone calm down. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Naomi said quietly. Her voice was calm, almost serene, but underneath it was a core of steel that had been forged over 23 years of building something from nothing, while people told her she couldn't. "I understand exactly what happened here. The question is, what happens next?" "What happens next?" Linda said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "is that you file a complaint, and it gets reviewed through the proper channels. Maybe you'll get a voucher for your trouble." She leaned closer, lowering her voice, so only Naomi could hear. "And maybe next time, you'll think twice about flying first class when you clearly don't belong there." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and naked, and finally honest. No more pretense about security protocols or verification procedures. Just the raw truth of what this had always been about. Naomi looked at Linda Marsh for a long moment. She looked at this woman who had decided based on nothing but skin color and clothing that Naomi didn't belong, who had used her small authority to humiliate and exclude, who had no idea, could not possibly have conceived of who she was actually dealing with. Naomi could have ended it right there. Could have pulled out her phone and called Marcus Chen her COO, and had Linda and Brad and Kevin terminated before the clock struck midnight. Could have revealed her identity and watched their faces crumble as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. It would have been satisfying in the moment. It would have felt like justice. But it wouldn't have changed anything. Linda would be fired and would go somewhere else and do the same thing to someone else. Brad would tell himself he was just following orders and learn nothing. Kevin would cover his tracks and continue covering for employees like Linda because it was easier than doing his job properly. The system that allowed this to happen would remain intact, waiting to victimize the next person who walked through that gate looking like they didn't belong. Naomi wanted something more than momentary satisfaction. She wanted change. Real change. The kind that would protect the next black woman who stood in this line with a valid ticket and a desire to simply be treated like a human being. "I'll be filing a complaint," Naomi said evenly. She turned and walked away from the gate, away from Linda's triumphant smirk and Brad's smug satisfaction, and Kevin's obvious relief that the situation had been resolved without further escalation. She found an empty seat near the window, far enough from Gate 47 to be away from the scene, but close enough to watch the aircraft push back from the jetway and begin its slow taxi toward the runway. The lights of the plane blinked against the darkness. Inside were 157 passengers who had been deemed worthy of travel. And here in an empty terminal at midnight on New Year's Eve sat one passenger who had not. Her phone buzzed. Her mother's text appeared on the screen. "Happy New Year baby ball just dropped. Where are you? Did you land?" Naomi stared at the words for a long moment. Her throat felt tight, in a way it hadn't felt since she was a young woman, struggling and striving and constantly being told she would never amount to anything. She had spent decades building armor against moments like this. Tonight, that armor had cracked, and something tender and wounded was bleeding through. She typed back slowly, carefully, making sure her mother wouldn't hear the pain in her words. "Flight got delayed, Mama. Weather issues. I'll get there as soon as I can. Don't wait up. Love you." The lie burned in her throat. Her mother had taught her never to lie, had raised her to face truth, even when it hurt. Dorothy Carter had worked 2 jobs for 18 years to put Naomi through. School, had scrubbed floors and ironed other people's clothes so her daughter could have opportunities she never had. And now Naomi couldn't tell her the truth. Couldn't explain that her successful daughter, her CEO daughter, her daughter who had risen from poverty to build an empire, had been denied boarding on her own airline because of the color of her skin. That knowledge would hurt her mother's fragile heart more than any flight delay ever could. Dorothy Carter had lived through Jim Crow and segregation and a lifetime of indignities that she rarely spoke about. She had desperately wanted to believe that things were different for her daughter's generation, that all the sacrifices had meant something, that the world had changed. Naomi couldn't bear to tell her that in some ways the world hadn't changed at all. She sat alone in the empty terminal and let herself feel it all. The anger and the hurt and the bone-deep exhaustion of being black in America, of never being able to escape the assumptions people made based on appearance of building wealth and power and success, only to discover that none of it mattered when you were standing in front of someone who had already decided you were less than. Then she opened her laptop and got to work. The Carter Aviation Holdings internal system required 2-factor authentication and a biometric scan security protocols that Naomi herself had insisted on implementing after a data breach at a competitor 3 years ago. She pressed her thumb to the sensor on her laptop, entered her access code, and watched the familiar interface load on her screen. The first thing she did was access the security camera network. Every inch of Terminal C was monitored by high-definition cameras, a $1 million investment that she had personally approved because she believed in accountability and evidence in the power of documented truth. She navigated to the feeds for Gate 47 and pulled up the recordings from the past 2 hours. She watched herself standing in line, watched Linda's expression change as she approached the counter, watched the entire confrontation unfold from multiple angles captured in crystalline detail, watched Linda deliberately close the boarding door while looking directly at her, a moment of premeditated cruelty preserved forever in digital footage. She downloaded the files and saved them to her secure cloud storage. Evidence, documentation, the raw material of accountability. Then she switched to the employee database and pulled up Linda Marsh's personnel file. What she found there made the cold thing in her chest turn to ice. 47 formal complaints in the past 6 months alone. 47 passengers who had filed grievances about treatment that ranged from rude to discriminatory to openly hostile. Naomi scrolled through them, reading the details of each complaint. A Hispanic family whose documents were questioned despite being in perfect order. An elderly black man who was asked if he knew how to operate his own wheelchair. A young Muslim woman who was subjected to additional screening that wasn't part of any official protocol and appeared to serve no purpose other than humiliation. A Nigerian businessman who was told his credit card probably didn't work in American machines. a Japanese tourist who was asked to prove she could speak English despite having conversed fluently with another agent moments before. Nearly 50 complaints, and in the notes section of each one, the same resolution. Reviewed by Supervisor Kevin Marshall. Determined to be unfounded. No action taken. Kevin had been covering for Linda, systematically dismissing every complaint, protecting her from consequences, allowing her to continue treating passengers with contempt based on their race or ethnicity or national origin. It wasn't just one bad employee. It was a culture of discrimination that had been allowed to flourish because the people responsible for preventing it were actively enabling it. Naomi pulled up Brad's file next. Fewer complaints, but a troubling pattern of using his security authority to intimidate passengers who questioned anything. 3 incidents in the past year where he had been accused of excessive force during confrontations that his own reports described as minor disagreements. Then Kevin's file. 22 years in the aviation industry, 12 with Carter Aviation Holdings, promoted to supervisor 3 years ago. Generally positive performance reviews until about 18 months ago when a notation appeared in his file. Wife diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Extended leave approved. Upon return performance showed marked decline. Multiple complaints from subordinates about lack of oversight and failure to address personnel issues. Naomi sat back and processed this information. Kevin Marshall was a man whose life had been upended by his wife's illness, who had probably been barely holding himself together for the past year and a half, who had taken the path of least resistance because he simply didn't have the emotional reserves to do his job properly. That didn't excuse what he had done, but it complicated the picture, made him less a villain and more a symptom of systemic failure. She thought about what she wanted to accomplish. Not revenge, though the temptation was powerful. Not destruction, though she had the ability to rain down consequences that would devastate the lives of everyone involved. She wanted something harder to achieve than either of those things. She wanted change. Real, lasting, systemic change that would protect every passenger who walked through her terminals, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Chen. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "I'm already getting dressed," he said without preamble. "What happened?" Naomi told him, briefly, factually, without embellishment. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'll be there in an hour," Marcus said finally. "Maybe less. I'm bringing Patricia from legal and James from HR. This is going to require a comprehensive response." "I want more than a response," Naomi said. "I want transformation. I want to understand how we created a system where this could happen, and I want to make sure it never happens again." "We'll figure it out," Marcus said. "Together. Like we always do." She ended the call and turned back to her laptop. There was more research to do, more evidence to gather, more understanding to develop before Marcus and the others arrived. She worked steadily, methodically, building a picture of systemic failure that went far beyond 3 employees behaving badly on a single night. The terminal was nearly empty now. The last flights had departed. The cleaning crews were making their rounds, picking up trash and vacuuming carpets, and preparing for tomorrow's chaos. A few stranded travelers slumped in chairs trying to sleep, waiting for morning flights that would take them where they needed to go. Naomi worked until 1:47 a.m. when Marcus Chen walked through the terminal entrance with Patricia Okonkwo and James Harrison close behind. They spotted her immediately, the only person in the departure area still awake, and active, her laptop screen glowing in the dim light. Nomi, Marcus said, sliding into the seat beside her. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, his coat buttoned incorrectly, but his eyes were sharp and focused. I read your preliminary findings on the drive over. This is worse than I thought. It's worse than any of us thought, Naomi replied. She turned the laptop to show them what she had found. Nearly 50 complaints in 6 months, all dismissed by the same supervisor. A pattern of discrimination so blatant it's almost hard to believe no one caught it. Patricia leaned in to study the screen. Her background was in corporate law, and her mind immediately went to liability. We have significant legal exposure here, she said. If any of these complainants decides to pursue litigation, they should pursue litigation, Naomi interrupted. Some of them, anyway. What happened to them was wrong. They deserve compensation and acknowledgement. She paused. But that's not why we're here tonight. Why are we here? James asked. He was the head of human resources, a careful man who prided himself on building systems that treated employees fairly while maintaining high standards. We're here to fix a broken system, Naomi said. Not to punish individuals, although there will be consequences for what happened tonight. We're here to understand how our culture drifted so far from what I built this company to be. And we're here to make sure it never happens again. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty runways, the distant lights of Newark glittering against the darkness. When I started this company, she said I had a vision. I wanted to create something different, something better. I wanted passengers to walk into our airports and feel welcomed, respected, valued. I wanted our employees to understand that their job wasn't just processing tickets and managing logistics. It was making people feel like they mattered. She turned back to face them. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. We got big, and we got successful, and we got comfortable, and we stopped paying attention to whether we were actually living up to our values. We let people like Kevin Marshall handle oversight because it was easier than doing the hard work of real accountability. We let people like Linda Marsh treat passengers like suspects because we didn't want to deal with the complaints and the union issues and the uncomfortable conversations. Patricia shifted in her seat. To be fair, Nomi, we've grown exponentially in the past 5 years. It's hard to maintain cultural consistency at this scale. I don't want excuses, Naomi said firmly. I want solutions. I want to understand exactly how we got here so we can make sure we don't end up here again. She returned to her seat and pulled up a document she had been drafting while waiting for them to arrive. Here's what's going to happen, she said. First, we're going to have a conversation with Linda Marsh Brad Cooper and Kevin Marshall. Tonight. Before they have a chance to coordinate their stories or delete any evidence, I want to look them in the eye and hear their explanations for what happened. And then Marcus asked. And then we're going to make some decisions, Naomi replied. Not just about these 3 individuals, but about how we run this company, about what kind of culture we want to create and what we're willing to do to maintain it, about whether we're actually committed to treating every passenger with dignity or whether that's just something we put in our marketing materials while allowing the reality to be something very different. She closed the laptop and stood. Kevin Marshall is still in the building. Operations supervisors are required to stay until the last flight lands. Let's go have a conversation. The group reviewed the evidence in detail during the wait, watching the security footage together, discussing the patterns they had uncovered. By 2:30 a.m., They had a clear picture of the systemic failures that had led to this moment. Kevin Marshall was sitting at his desk in the operations office when they arrived, scrolling through his phone, with the distracted attention of a man counting down the minutes until his shift ended. He looked up when the door opened, and Naomi watched his expression cycle through several phases in rapid succession. Surprise at the late-night visitors, recognition of Marcus Chen, whose face had appeared in industry publications, confusion at the presence of people who clearly didn't belong in an airport operations office at 2 a.m, and then slowly the dawning comprehension that something was very wrong. "Mr. Chen," Kevin said, scrambling to his feet so quickly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "I wasn't expecting. We don't usually get visitors from corporate at this hour." "Not corporate," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who was very angry and keeping it tightly controlled. "Ownership." He stepped aside and gestured toward Naomi. "I believe you've already met Ms. Naomi Carter, our CEO." The color drained from Kevin's face. It happened so quickly that Naomi could almost track the blood retreating from his skin, leaving him gray and slightly swaying. He looked at her worn sweater and casual jeans, and she could see him trying to reconcile this ordinary-looking woman with the title that had just been attached to her name. He started, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "There must be some kind of—" "There's no misunderstanding," Naomi said. She walked into the office with measured steps, each one deliberate and controlled. "My name is Naomi Carter. I founded Carter Aviation Holdings in 2001. I own 63% of this company. This terminal, the operating contracts with every airline that flies out of this building, the paycheck you deposit every 2 weeks, all of it exists because I spent 23 years building something I believed in." She stopped directly in front of his desk and looked at him with an expression that conveyed nothing but calm certainty. "And 3 hours ago, you threatened to have me arrested for trying to board a flight in my own terminal, surrounded by employees whose salaries I pay." Kevin's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. He looked like a man who had just discovered that the ground he was standing on was not solid earth, but thin ice over deep water. "Ms. Carter," he finally managed, his voice cracking on the first syllable. "I had no idea it was you. If you had known, Naomi interrupted quietly. "That's exactly the point, isn't it? You treated me differently because you didn't know who I was, because you looked at me and made assumptions based on what you saw. And those assumptions led you to threaten an innocent passenger with arrest for the crime of questioning why she was being singled out." She pulled out a chair and sat down across from his desk, crossing her legs with the casual authority of someone who was entirely in control of the situation. "Let me ask you something, Kevin. If I had been a white woman in a designer suit, would you have threatened to call the police? Would you have allowed your staff to suggest I didn't belong in first class?" Kevin opened his mouth, closed it again. No words came out. "I've reviewed your records," Naomi continued. "Nearly 50 complaints about Linda Marsh in 6 months. Every single one dismissed by you. Every single one marked as unfounded. Nearly 50 passengers who felt discriminated against, humiliated, treated as less than human. And you looked at every one of those complaints and decided they had no merit." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you really believe that all those people were wrong? That they all misinterpreted the situation? That Linda Marsh was just doing her job and everyone who complained was simply too sensitive?" Kevin's eyes dropped to the floor. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 20? 30. He started, then stopped. I didn't want to deal with it. Naomi waited. Every time I wrote someone up, Kevin continued, his voice barely audible. There was paperwork, investigations, union grievances, HR meetings. It took forever, and nothing ever changed anyway. She'd get a warning and go right back to doing the same thing. It was easier to just let it go. Easier, Naomi repeated. For you. Not for the grandmother who was questioned like a criminal. Not for the businessman who was accused of having a fake credit card. Not for the young woman in the hijab who was pulled aside for additional screening that served no purpose except to humiliate her. Their experiences didn't matter because dealing with the truth was inconvenient for you. Kevin said nothing. There was nothing to say. Call Linda. And Brad, Naomi said. Tell them there's an emergency corporate investigation and their presence is mandatory. Don't mention my name. Don't tell them what it's about. I want to see how they explain themselves when they don't know who they're talking to. Kevin reached for his phone with trembling hands. Linda Marsh arrived at 3:12 a.m., clearly annoyed at being called back to work in the middle of the night. She walked into the conference room with the aggressive energy of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of celebrating and wanted everyone to know it. Her makeup was slightly smudged, and there was a faint smell of champagne on her breath. What so urgent that it couldn't wait until she started, then stopped abruptly when she saw who was sitting at the conference table. Naomi watched the recognition dawn. Watched Linda's eyes widen as she placed the face connected it to the confrontation at Gate 47. Realized that the situation was far worse than a simple callback to work. Good morning, Ms. Marsh, Naomi said calmly. Please have a seat. Linda didn't move. Her face had gone pale, then flushed, then pale again. What is this? This is a meeting, Naomi replied. About the events that occurred at Gate 47 approximately 4 hours ago. Please sit down. Linda sat. Her hands were shaking slightly as she placed them on the table in front of her. Brad Cooper arrived 11 minutes later, his swagger notably absent when he walked through the door and saw the assembled group. He took in the scene, the corporate executives, the CEO he had threatened with arrest the supervisor, who looked like he might be sick at any moment, and whatever bravado he had carried through his career seemed to evaporate. Mr. Cooper, Naomi said. Please join us. The next 2 hours were among the most intense of Naomi's professional life, and she had lived through corporate takeovers and hostile board meetings and negotiations where hundreds of millions of dollars hung in the balance. But those had been about money, about power, about the abstract chess games of high-level business. This was personal. This was about standing in a line and being told she didn't belong, about being treated as less than human by people who had judged her based on nothing but the color of her skin and the simplicity of her clothes. She didn't yell, she didn't threaten, she simply asked questions and let the answers condemn the people who gave them. Linda, she began, when you looked at me tonight, what did you see? Linda's lower lip trembled. I don't understand the question. Yes, you do. When I handed you my boarding pass before you even looked at it, you had already made a judgment about me. I could see it in your face. So tell me, what was that judgment? The silence stretched. Linda's eyes darted around the room looking for escape or support or some way out of answering. She found none. I thought... She started, her voice barely audible. I thought you might be trying to scam your way into first class. We get that sometimes. People who buy cheap tickets and try to upgrade by complaining or causing a scene. What about me suggested I was running a scam? Naomi asked. My valid ticket, my matching ID, my calm demeanor. Linda didn't answer. Let me rephrase the question, Naomi said. Did you have the same concerns about any of the white passengers who boarded before me? The man in the business suit, the young couple in casual clothes, the elderly woman with the expensive handbag. That's different. How Naomi's voice remained calm, almost gentle, but the question was sharp as a scalpel. How is it different? They all had tickets. They all had IDs. Some of them were dressed more casually than I was. What made them above suspicion and me below it? Linda's composure cracked. Tears started streaming down her face, but Naomi felt no sympathy. These weren't tears of genuine remorse. They were the tears of someone who had been caught, who was afraid of consequences, who was crying for herself, rather than for the people she had hurt. I've worked in customer service for 15 years, Linda said through her tears. You develop instincts. You learn to spot trouble. Instincts, Naomi repeated. She turned to Marcus. Would you pull up the comparison footage, please? Marcus opened his laptop and turned it so everyone in the room could see the screen. The video showed a split-screen comparison. Linda's interactions with white passengers versus her interactions with passengers of color. The contrast was stark, undeniable, damning. The warm smiles and casual conversation on one side, the suspicious scrutiny and defensive body language on the other. This is what your instincts look like when we capture them on camera, Naomi said. This is the pattern you've been following for at least 6 months based on the complaints we've documented. Nearly 50 people who experienced exactly what I experienced tonight, except they didn't have the power to do anything about it, except file a complaint that was immediately dismissed. She turned to Brad. And you? When Linda called you over and said there was a situation, what did you assume? Brad shifted uncomfortably. I assumed there was a security concern, based on what evidence she said. She said there was a situation, Naomi interrupted. She didn't say there was a security threat, or an unruly passenger, or someone breaking rules. She said, situation. And when you arrived and saw me, a black woman in casual clothes, you immediately positioned yourself in an intimidating stance and demanded additional identification. Why? Brad's jaw tightened. I was following protocol. Show me the protocol, Naomi said. Show me where it says that passengers who have provided valid boarding passes and government-issued ID should be subjected to additional verification based on the gate agent's gut feeling. Brad didn't respond. Show me the protocol that says security guards should invade passengers' personal space and rest their hands near their radios during routine document verification, Naomi continued. Show me the protocol that says African American passengers should be treated differently than white passengers with identical credentials. There is no such protocol, Brad finally admitted. His voice had lost all its earlier aggression. He sounded defeated, small. No, Naomi agreed. There isn't. What you were following wasn't protocol. It was bias. Prejudice. The assumption that someone who looks like me is more likely to be a criminal than someone who looks like you. She turned finally to Kevin. And you, the supervisor, the person whose job it is to ensure that employees treat all passengers fairly and professionally. You arrived at that scene, and what did you do? Kevin couldn't meet her eyes. I tried to de-escalate. By threatening to have me arrested for trespassing, Naomi said. By telling me you didn't have to explain your security protocols. By making it clear that I had no rights that you were bound to respect. That's your idea of de-escalation. Kevin's head dropped into his hands. I was just trying to end the situation, he mumbled. I didn't know who you were. I thought if I was firm enough, you'd just go away. And that's the whole problem, isn't it? Naomi said quietly. You wanted me to go away. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I was inconvenient. Because dealing with a passenger who asked questions was harder than dealing with a passenger who simply accepted whatever treatment was given. Because you had already decided, based on nothing but my appearance, that I was the problem, rather than the employees who were discriminating against me. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of what had been exposed settled over everyone like a physical presence. Naomi stood and walked to the window, looking out at the first gray light of dawn beginning to color the eastern sky. A new year, a new day, a chance to build something different. Here's what happens now, she said, her back still to the room. I've thought about this very carefully. I've considered the legal implications, the HR protocols, the PR fallout, all of it. But more than that, I've thought about what I actually want to accomplish, what kind of company I want this to be, what kind of change I want to create. She turned to face them. I don't want revenge. Revenge is satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't change anything. The person you punish just gets angry and goes somewhere else and does the same thing to someone else. They never learn because punishment doesn't teach, it just hurts. She walked back to the table and sat down. What I want is transformation. I want the three of you to understand, really understand what you did tonight and why it was wrong. I want you to feel the weight of the complaints you dismissed, Kevin. The dozens of passengers you humiliated, Linda. The people you intimidated into silence, Brad. Not so you can wallow in guilt, but so you can change. So you can become the kind of people who would never do these things again. Linda looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. You mean we're not fired? I don't know yet, Naomi replied honestly. That depends on you, on whether you're capable of genuine growth and change, or whether you're just going to tell me what you think I want to hear so you can keep your jobs. She outlined the consequences she had decided on. Linda would be suspended without pay for 90 days, during which time she would complete an intensive training program on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and customer service ethics. She would participate in facilitated conversations with some of the passengers she had discriminated against, hearing firsthand the impact of her behavior. At the end of the 90 days, she would be evaluated. If she demonstrated genuine understanding and change, she could return in a probationary capacity. If not, she would be terminated. Brad would receive a formal written warning and be required to complete 40 hours of community service with organizations serving communities of color. He would also complete de-escalation training and be reassigned to a role where he supported other officers rather than directly interacting with passengers until he demonstrated sustained behavioral change. Kevin would be demoted from supervisor to customer service agent. He would rebuild his career from the ground up, demonstrating through his actions that he understood what had gone wrong under his watch. He would also be required to personally review every discrimination complaint filed in this terminal for the next year under direct oversight from HR. If any complaint was improperly dismissed, he would be terminated immediately. These aren't punishments, Naomi explained. They're opportunities. opportunities to learn to grow, to become better at your jobs and better as human beings. Whether you take those opportunities or waste them is entirely up to you. Patricia looked skeptical. Naomi, she said carefully, this is more lenient than most people would expect. Given what happened. I know, Naomi replied. But I've spent my whole life watching punitive systems fail to change behavior. People get fired, they get angry, they file wrongful termination suits. They go somewhere else and do the same things. The system that created them remains intact, ready to produce more people just like them. I want something different. I want to break the cycle. She looked at each of them in turn. Linda with her tear-stained face, Brad with his rigid posture, Kevin with the hollow eyes of a man who knew his world had shifted beneath him. The people sitting in front of you aren't the only problem, she said. If they were, this would be easy. Fire them, hire replacements, problem solved. But the truth is, there are probably dozens of people in our company doing similar things every day, treating passengers differently, based on their appearance, making assumptions based on bias, rather than evidence cutting corners on accountability because it's easier than doing the right thing. You're not unique, Naomi continued. You're symptoms of a disease that's infected our culture. And I'm not interested in treating symptoms while ignoring the underlying condition. I'm going to fix this company, all of it. Every terminal, every gate, every customer interaction. We're going to implement new training programs, new accountability measures, new oversight systems. We're going to make sure that what happened to me tonight never happens to anyone again. She stood up. And you three are going to help me do it. Not because I'm forcing you, but because you're going to choose to be part of the solution. Because you're going to understand that this is your chance to make something good come out of something terrible. Or you're going to leave, and that's fine too, but you won't leave unchanged. What happened tonight is going to stay with you forever, whether you learn from it or not. She gathered her things and headed for the door. Marcus will provide you with detailed instructions about next steps. I'll be monitoring your progress personally, and I'll be visiting this terminal regularly, sometimes announced, and sometimes not, to see how things are actually operating on the ground. She paused at the door and looked back at them one final time. I believe people can change, she said quietly. I have to believe that, or there's no point in anything I do. Don't make me wrong. Then she walked out into the early morning light of a new year, a new day, and the beginning of something different. The weeks that followed were intense, transformative, and sometimes painful. Naomi threw herself into the work of systemic change with the same energy and focus she had brought to building her company in the first place. She called it the Dignity First Initiative, and she was determined to make it more than just a PR campaign or a box-checking exercise. The training program she developed was unlike anything the aviation industry had seen before. It wasn't a boring PowerPoint about diversity statistics or a quick online module that employees could click through while checking their phones. It was a 40-hour immersive experience facilitated by psychologists, civil rights educators, and people who had personally experienced discrimination in their travels. Employees participated in role-playing exercises where they experienced what it felt like to be scrutinized, questioned, and made to feel unwelcome. They heard directly from passengers who had filed complaints, sitting face-to-face with the real human beings whose experiences they might have dismissed as exaggeration or oversensitivity. They explored the history of discrimination in America and examined how unconscious bias developed and operated in everyday interactions. The resistance was immediate and predictable. Some employees rolled their eyes and complained about political correctness. Some managers grumbled about the time and expense. A few people quit rather than participate, which Naomi considered an acceptable loss. She wasn't interested in forcing compliance. She was interested in building a team of people who genuinely understood why this mattered. The accountability measures she implemented were equally comprehensive. An anonymous hotline for passengers to report discrimination, monitored by an independent third party rather than internal supervisors. Mandatory camera review of random customer interactions with clear consequences for employees who treated passengers differently based on race, ethnicity, or appearance. Quarterly public reports on complaint patterns and resolution outcomes published on the company website for anyone to see. She restructured the complaint review process entirely. No more single supervisors deciding whether complaints had merit. Instead, a panel that included HR representatives, legal counsel, and community members reviewed each complaint and determined appropriate responses. She established partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, creating pipeline programs for young people interested in aviation careers. She required diversity on the short lists for all leadership positions. She created community advisory boards at each of her 8 terminals, made up of local residents who could provide feedback and hold management accountable. And through it all, she was visible. She led training sessions personally. She sat in on complaint review meetings. She walked the terminals of all 8 airports she owned, talking to employees and passengers alike about what dignity meant and what respect looked like in practice. The public response when news of the incident inevitably leaked was intense. Someone had recorded the confrontation at Gate 47, and the video spread across social media rapidly. News outlets from CNN to local newspapers covered the story. Naomi gave interviews not to make herself look good, but to use the attention as a platform for talking about systemic change. "What happened to me was wrong," she said in one interview that was widely shared. "But I had power. I had resources. I had the ability to do something about it. What haunts me is thinking about all the people who experience the same thing and have no recourse. The grandmother who gets questioned about her ticket and has no CEO credentials to fall back on. The young man who gets singled out for additional screening and has no choice but to submit quietly if he wants to make his flight. Those are the people I'm thinking about as we rebuild our company culture." The changes she implemented became a model for the industry. Other airlines and airports began adopting elements of the Dignity First initiative, which was exactly what Naomi wanted. She made her training materials freely available to any company that wanted to use them. She spoke at industry conferences about the business case for treating customers with respect. She commissioned research on the relationship between discriminatory treatment and customer loyalty, publishing data that showed how bias was not just morally wrong, but also economically counterproductive. Not everyone was convinced. Some critics accused her of overreacting, of making a big deal out of an isolated incident. Some employees continued to resist the changes, grumbling about being forced to walk on eggshells. The culture shift was slow and uneven, with some terminals embracing the new standards and others lagging behind. But the metrics told a story of progress. Discrimination complaints dropped by 63% in the first year of the Dignity First initiative. Employee retention improved as workers reported feeling clearer about expectations and more supported in doing their jobs well. Customer satisfaction scores rose across all demographics. The airports that fully embraced the changes saw measurable improvements in efficiency and profitability, suggesting that treating people with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. Linda Marsh completed her suspension and training program. She participated in the facilitated conversations with passengers she had wronged, sitting across from people whose faces she had forgotten, and listening to how her behavior had made them feel. Some of those conversations were brutal. Some ended with passengers refusing to accept her apologies, which was their right. But some ended with something like understanding, with the recognition that people could change if they chose to. When her 90 days were up, Linda returned to work at a different terminal under close supervision, with clear understanding that any further incidents would result in immediate termination. She was quieter now, more thoughtful, more careful. Whether she had truly changed or was simply afraid of consequences, only time would tell. But she was no longer the same person who had looked at a black woman in a cashmere sweater and seen someone who didn't belong. Brad Cooper completed his community service and training requirements. He struggled more than Linda did, resistant to acknowledging that he had done anything wrong, prone to defensive arguments about how he was just doing his job. But something shifted during his community service, working with organizations that served communities he had never really engaged with before. He began to see the people he had intimidated not as abstract threats, but as individuals with lives and families and stories of their own. Kevin Marshall's journey was the most complicated. Demoted to customer service agent, he initially seemed crushed, going through the motions of his job with the hollow efficiency of a man who had lost all sense of purpose. But over time, something began to change. Working directly with passengers, instead of managing from a distance, he began to reconnect with why he had entered this industry in the first place. His wife's cancer went into remission. It wasn't a cure, just a reprieve, but it gave him space to process everything that had happened. He started therapy for the first time in his life. He began to understand that his failures as a supervisor weren't just about being overwhelmed by his wife's illness. They were about taking shortcuts, avoiding discomfort, choosing the easy path over the right one. After 6 months, he asked to be considered for a new position in the newly created Office of Passenger Experience, working specifically on complaint resolution and employee development. Naomi approved the transfer. She believed in second chances, and Kevin Marshall had earned his. 1 year after the incident at Gate 47, Naomi stood in Terminal C of Newark Liberty International Airport. It was December 31st again. 11:45 p.m. again. The gate where she had been denied boarding was busy with passengers queuing for the last flight to Atlanta. She wasn't traveling tonight. She was watching. The gate agent was a young Latina woman named Rosa Martinez, who had joined the company 8 months ago as part of the expanded recruitment initiative. She wore her uniform with pride and processed passengers with the efficient warmth that Naomi had always wanted her employees to demonstrate. Naomi observed as Rosa handled each passenger. A white businessman received a professional smile and quick processing. An elderly black couple received the same professional smile and quick processing, plus an offer to help them with their carry-on bags. A young man in a hoodie and worn jeans received the same professional smile and quick processing, with no questions about whether his first-class ticket was legitimate. A young black woman approached the counter. She wore casual clothes, Comfortable shoes, no obvious indicators of wealth or status. She handed over her boarding pass and ID, with something that looked almost like apprehension, as if bracing for the scrutiny she had learned to expect. Rosa looked at the documents, looked at the passenger, and smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard. You're in seat 3C. Can I help you with anything else?" The young woman blinked clearly, surprised by the simple courtesy. "No," she said slowly, "thank you. That's all I need." "Have a wonderful flight," Rosa said, "and Happy New Year." The young woman walked toward the jetway with an expression that Naomi recognized. It was the expression of someone who had expected to be challenged and questioned and made to prove herself, and who had instead been treated with ordinary human dignity. It was such a small thing, really, just basic respect. But for people who had learned not to expect it, receiving it could feel like a revelation. Naomi walked to the counter after the boarding line had cleared. Rosa looked up and recognition flickered across her face. "Ms. Carter, I didn't know you were here tonight." Just observing, Naomi said, "You did well." Every passenger treated with the same respect, regardless of what they looked like. Rosa smiled, but there was something serious underneath it. "Can I ask you something, Ms. Carter?" "Of course." "That last passenger, the young black woman in casual clothes. She looked surprised when I was just normal to her, like she expected something different." Naomi nodded slowly. She probably did. She probably expected to be questioned about whether her ticket was legitimate, or asked for additional ID, or made to feel like she didn't belong in first class. It happens more often than most people realize. Rosa's expression shifted to something like determination. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Those 3 words meant more to Naomi than any financial report or industry award. They meant the culture was changing. Not perfectly, not everywhere, not completely, but changing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the gold boarding pass from that night a year ago, worn and soft from being handled so many times. She had kept it as a reminder. On the back, in her own handwriting, were the words she looked at every morning before she started her day. "Not every battle is won with power. Some are won with patience principle, and the courage to turn pain into purpose." "Keep this," she said, handing it to Rosa. "Put it somewhere you'll see it often. Let it remind you why we do this job. Not to judge who belongs, to serve everyone with dignity." Rosa unfolded the paper carefully and read the handwritten words on the back. Her eyes glistened slightly. "I will," she said. "I promise." Naomi walked away from the gate as the clock approached midnight. Around her, travelers were counting down, kissing loved ones, raising plastic cups of champagne from the terminal bars. The same chaos as every New Year's Eve. The same desperate energy of people trying to get somewhere else. The same mixture of hope and exhaustion and determination. But something was different now. Different in the small ways that actually mattered. In the gate, agents who looked at passengers and saw human beings rather than threats. In the security guards who understood that their job was to protect everyone, not just people who looked like them. In the supervisors who actually supervised, who held their teams accountable, who understood that cutting corners on dignity was never acceptable. She found a quiet spot by the window, looking out at the runways lit up against the dark sky. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Happy New Year, baby, so proud of you. Flying down next week to see you." Naomi smiled and typed back, "Can't wait, Mama. Love you more than words." She put the phone away and watched the planes taking off into the night, each one carrying hundreds of people to their destinations, their families, their futures. Not all of those passengers would be treated perfectly. The work was never finished. Bias didn't disappear because you implemented training programs and accountability measures. People didn't transform overnight just because leadership demanded it. But some of them would be treated better than they would have been a year ago. Some of them would board without being questioned or challenged or made to prove they belonged. Some of them would arrive at their destinations feeling like valued customers rather than suspects who had been grudgingly allowed to travel. That mattered. Not because it was enough. It wasn't. But because it was progress. Because it was proof that change was possible. Because it was a foundation on which more change could be built. A year ago, she had sat in this terminal alone on New Year's Eve, watching her flight take off without her feeling the weight of injustice pressing down on her chest. She had been denied boarding in her own terminal by employees whose salaries she paid because she had committed the unforgivable crime of being a black woman who didn't look wealthy enough to deserve respect. She had two choices in that moment. She could have used her power for revenge, could have fired everyone involved, made an example of them, extracted her pound of flesh. It would have felt satisfying. It would have felt like justice. Or she could use her power for something harder, something that required patience when she wanted to rage forgiveness, when she wanted to punish faith in human capacity for growth, when experience had given her every reason for doubt. She had chosen the harder path, not because she was a saint or because she didn't feel anger. She felt it. She still felt it sometimes in quiet moments when she remembered Linda's voice saying, "There's no room for people like you." The anger didn't go away just because she chose not to let it guide her actions. But she had learned something over 23 years of building a company from nothing, while people told her she would fail. She had learned that the most powerful thing you can do with anger is transform it. Not suppress it, not ignore it, not let it consume you. Transform it into fuel for change, into energy for building something better, into determination to create a world where the thing that made you angry can never happen again. The clock struck midnight. Fireworks exploded somewhere in the distance, visible through the terminal windows as bursts of color against the dark sky. A new year began. Naomi Carter, CEO and founder of Carter Aviation Holdings, the woman who had been told there was no room for people like her, stood in the terminal she owned and watched the future take flight. Real power isn't about who you can hurt. It's about who you can protect. How many lives you can change. What kind of world you can build in the space where injustice used to live. If this story made you think, share it. Because change doesn't start with power. It starts with the courage to see injustice and refuse to look away.